Am I dying, Daddy? The question arrived as a paper-thin whisper, small as breath and sharp as cold air. It hung between the fluorescent hum and the distant squeak of a cart. Daniel Ward's hand stopped mid-sweep over the hospital floor. The broom bristles froze. The world narrowed to the child's voice and the tremor beneath it. He crouched until he was at the child's level. The room smelled of lemon disinfectant and warmed plastic. Machines sighed on stands. Outside, a winter sun lay low and flat, slanting a pale strip of light across the linoleum. Daniel took from his pocket the thin square of cloth he always kept. The fabric, embroidered along the edge in tiny blue thread, was Sarah's old handkerchief. He wiped his palms on it, not because he needed to, but because the habit steadied him. "Hey," he said softly, keeping his voice steady because the rest of the room depended on small steadiness. "No, not unless the doctors tell us something." The child's brown eyes were big enough to hold the ceiling lights. Her body was thin and wrapped in familiar banded blankets. A brace supported one leg. She smiled, trying for brave, and asked again, more like a practice than a question. "Are you sure?" Daniel felt his throat tighten the way it had at their kitchen table when Lily, his daughter, had asked if the moon was lonely. He offered the only small truth he had. "We'll listen. We'll ask. I'm right here." He stayed on his knees. Around them, other parents sat in chairs, glued to screens or to gossiping whisper lines. A woman in the corner dangled the end of a surgical mask and laughed when the television played a commercial. A man checked his watch 3 times before shifting impatiently. People had arrived with urgent reasons of their own. The hospital's chairs held a dozen private worries. Most glanced past the small bed as if it were part of the wallpaper. Daniel smoothed the blanket at the foot of the bed as if that mattered. The child, Emily, a name printed on a bright sticker, reached for his hand and slipped their fingers together like a promise. She squeezed, the pressure light, as if asking whether human contact could be enough to hold the world steady. No one had expected a janitor to be there. He wasn't supposed to be the comfort in a place designed for specialists and somber talk. But Daniel was used to making himself necessary where he could, sweeping, fixing a slot for a broken wheel on a cart, silencing a clatter that would irritate an already tired nurse. He carried a set of keys, a mop, and the smaller, secret things. A folded paper airplane for Lily, a small book marked with a receipt he had once thought about framing. He used to be an engineer. Once he had stood in rooms like this, only with different authority, speaking about load-bearing beams and environmental controls. Sarah had believed in his hands, in the way you believe in warmth under a heavy blanket. After she died, the job he loved felt too loud with absence. He took a different route into the world. Less prestige, more hours, but with what he could give, he bought time to be a father. He collected Lily's after-school stories and answered her silly questions. He learned how to make a little ritual of ordinary moments. Pancakes on Wednesdays, bedtime stories with voices, the embroidered handkerchief folded into his pocket like a map back to what he once was. If you looked closely, there were signs. A bent screwdriver tucked into his toolbox, the careful way he could see a loose hinge. A janitor's shirt covered a man who once calculated tolerances, and tolerances were still how he thought, about the moments people could bear and the edges they could fall off. He had learned humility the hard way. He had also learned how to see people. "Hey," he said again to Emily, "tell me a song, okay? I'll play it." She named a tune, a clumsy pop song Lily adored, and Daniel, with the permission of a passing nurse, borrowed a phone, set it to a small speaker, and let a bit of music fill the room. The sound was ridiculous next to the beeps and the hiss of oxygen, but it was sound, and it was ordinary. Emily laughed. Her shoulders eased as though someone had opened a window and let a small current of air through. If you believe dignity matters, tap subscribe. Stories like this remind us why. He kept his eyes on Emily while the rest of the ward continued its slow machine of worry. The brief smile on her face moved through the room like a ripple. A woman waiting by the coffee machine looked up and softened. A man, who had been muttering into his phone, stopped mid-sentence and watched. Someone near the nurse's station leaned forward, with the look of a person remembering something kind they had once seen and then almost forgotten. Daniel had a habit of noticing what others passed by. He had learned to see details: the scar behind a nurse's ear from a childhood fall, the childish shoe tucked under a chair, the woman who always reheated soup in a paper cup no matter the season. He had watched how people avoided the small, inconvenient pain of connection. They chose grazing glances and turned away when real sight demanded response. Across the corridor, a cluster of visitors gathered in whispers. A parent, whose child's room overlooked the garden, made the kind of comment meant to shield oneself from discomfort. "She looks so fragile," they said, the phrase sliding from their mouth under the thin veil of pity, which is often the easiest form of seeing without responsibility. Emily heard it too. Her fingers tightened on Daniel's hand for a moment. "You hear that?" she whispered. "They think I'm not normal." "No," Daniel said. "You're more." He didn't live by big words. He lived by small acts. Tucking in an extra blanket, finding a missing stuffed animal, making a stranger laugh when they thought they'd forgotten how. He rolled the bed a little closer to the window until a thin sweep of light painted Emily's cheek. He angled the curtain so that warmth rested on her knees. He had a way of turning small spaces into moments. Once, in the middle of a grueling night shift when the fluorescent lights made everyone look like ghosts, he had gathered a few glow sticks from the pediatric play cart and made a constellation above a child's bed. The child named the stars, and soon a nurse came in to see and left smiling. The stars did not change the diagnosis. They did not make pain vanish, but they made the child visible to more than the charts on the wall. Emily's mother, she had been absent for most of the morning. An escorted hand appeared now at the doorway, arrived and hovered like a shadow. She had a look of exhausted vigilance, the sort that tells you every decision has been made by hope and fear in equal measure. She watched Daniel adjust Emily's pillow, and something like relief flitted through her face. Not because the janitor could cure anything, but because someone had paused the roar of urgency and simply been human. The ward's television hummed with the oblique cheer of daytime programming. Outside, two orderlies passed, pushing a gurney. A phone vibrated, and the chime of a child's ringtone, Lily's, rustled through Daniel's pocket. He smiled at the small sound, both anchor and ache. Lily's image flashed on his screen, a face plastered with glue and glitter from school. He answered quickly, voice soft because he was at work. "Hey, kiddo, what did you build today?" "I made a bridge out of popsicle sticks," Lily said, exhaling a proud breath into the line. "Can you see it when you come home?" "Of course," he promised. A father's promise is a practical thing. He could not fix everything, but he would be home for pancakes, and he would listen for every small success that sound made. Back in the room, Emily asked him a new question, not about death now, but about whether a person could be brave and scared at the same time. "Yes," he said, "you can be both at once. It's allowed." The word dignity hung between them like a small, bright stone. For Emily, it was a matter of being treated as a person. For Daniel, it was how he kept himself whole in a world that kept ranking people by usefulness. He had seen it in the way nurses moved past a chart but slowed for a child's laugh. That's when she walked in. Victoria Lane was all edges in a tailored coat, the kind of presence that trimmed the air as she moved through it. She belonged to a different kind of authority. one that came with schedules, meetings with boards, and a voice people deferred to. She had been at the hospital more times than she could count, not because she enjoyed the antiseptic air, but because running a children's hospital required a vigilance that was almost parental. She kept lists in folders and names in a way that made large systems look like careful gardens. She had a child of her own once who had been in this very wing. She had promises in the ledger that no spreadsheet could quite hold. Her hair was pulled back, her expression trained to the careful neutrality of a director. She had come that morning to review staffing, to walk through a ward that was repeatedly in her care. She wanted to see whether the policies she signed were being lived out in the light. What she had not expected to do, what no one expects to do, was to stop because a janitor had pushed a bed to the window and turned on a ridiculous pop song. She saw the small tableau as she passed. A young girl, hair wisps like feathers, laughing with a man in a faded uniform who belonged to the hospital's night and day life of clearing, mending, and holding. His hands had the careful steadiness of someone who had once worked with fine tolerances. He heard him use the name of a song she recognized from her own child's playlists. She watched him adjust a blanket. The director watched him be gentle and ordinary. She could have kept walking. That was how power often worked, by moving without being moved. But something in the way the light caught that embroidered square of cloth at his wrist, a scrap of human history folded into his pocket, made her stop. She had been taught to measure things by outcomes and audits. She had meetings about occupancy rates while conference lights hum overhead. She signed letters promising improvements and shuffled budgets for programs. But there were moments, rare, inconvenient, when the ledger had to step aside and a human report was required. What the eyes had seen, what a heart had felt. Standing in the doorway, she felt the tug of one of those moments like a physical thing. She walked into the room, a little unnatural in the human softness she'd always kept tightly reined. She watched the way a nurse's shoulders softened when she entered, and the ward's small irritations slid into shape, as if the building itself recognized the presence of its steward. Seeing the girl smiling, she allowed a small private relief. For a minute, she imagined the child was her own, a fleeting mirror that flushed her face and made her pause longer than planned. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, not because she doubted the answer, but because it was part of her job to ask. The nurse explained quickly. "Just a bit of boredom, director. He turned on a song. It's nice." Victoria looked at Daniel. He straightened, humility folding him back to his posture. She saw the badge on his shirt that read Ward Maintenance, and for a moment she saw nothing more than another name on a long roster. Then a sound from her phone, an alert she had set for rounds, reminded her of an appointment she had scheduled, a review of a case in this very room that morning. She stepped closer to the bed and read Emily's chart as if the words were a foreign language. The test results had come in overnight and were attached to the file. She had the power, by virtue of her title, to decide how this room would proceed. She also, for reasons she didn't give words for, wanted to listen before she acted. She adjusted her gloves as directors sometimes did when confronted with things that could not be solved with signatures. "Has anyone reviewed the latest scans?" she asked. The charge nurse who had been on duty shook her head. "We were waiting for the radiologist's full read, but—" "We need to do that now," Victoria said. Her voice carried the crispness of someone who had been responsible for difficult truths. She asked the nurse to bring the doctor on call. Within minutes, an examination unfolded, a soft, professional choreography. The doctor's demeanor was patient and clinical. He explained the images the way a cartographer explains a map, placidly, with a need to be precise. "It looks like the disease has progressed," he said. The words were small and exact. There are changes that suggest it's more advanced than we thought. Time rearranged itself. Emily's mother reached for her daughter's hand. Emily's face, which had been laughing, unmoored into worry again. Daniel felt a knot in his stomach in the way he felt when a rehearsal for loss became real. Victoria could have left it there. The medical truth stated, the circulation of anxiety resumed. But she had been watching people all morning. She had watched the room's soft reaction when Daniel pushed the bed to the window. She watched the way a simple human act had altered the heat of the room. She also knew that hospitals were not only houses of medicine, they were houses of dignity. And sometimes the hardest truths were not just clinical, they were institutional. They required an answer not only of treatment, but of how people were being seen, or ignored, behind the charts. She stepped forward. "I'm going to be frank," she said, and the words settled across the room. "The scan shows progression. We need to prepare for serious measures. That is the medical truth. I won't sugarcoat it for you." Her voice was calm, almost clinical, but there was a protein of sorrow inside it. She was offering reality as a thing that, when named, became less monstrous because people could put their hands around it. She continued, "But there are other things we must address. It's come to my attention we've missed some signs in Emily's case earlier. I am sorry for that. Not all mistakes are malicious. Some are born of systems that forget to prioritize seeing the person instead of the file. We will review what happened. We will involve the needed support. That is a promise I can keep." Her hand found the edge of the bed rail, almost as if grounding herself to the human thing in front of her. A silence longer than end-of-shift sigh spread. Parents shifted in their chairs. The gossiping stopped. The woman by the coffee machine swallowed. The man with the watch straightened. People's faces, momentarily checked into their own small dramas, turned toward Emily as if someone had opened a window and allowed daylight to spill into an otherwise dim place. Seeing is contagious when it does not ask anything in return. Someone in the doorway, a visitor, had been recording the scene on a phone. Small videos multiply quickly in a hospital where every human drama finds an audience. The clip captured a director speaking plainly, a janitor with a handkerchief, a girl who laughed at a pop song and then sat very still as the room shifted. It did not take long for the scene to move beyond the ward's walls. Victoria stepped further. She did something the ledger could not have required of her. She named Daniel in a way that reframed him. "Sir," she said, addressing him by the authority that matched hers, "what's your name?" "Daniel," he answered. "You work here in maintenance?" "Yes." "You were here just now when Emily needed the window," she said. "Thank you." He gave her a short, embarrassed nod. He kept his voice small because he recognized the imbalance of the conversation. "I just wanted her to feel the sun." "You did more than that." She adjusted her coat and looked at Emily, then at the mother, then back at Daniel. "I want you to know I'm going to make sure we do better here. And I want you to stay. I want to see what else you might help us notice." He blinked. A frail, unlisted ripple of stunned gratitude crossed his face. He had not expected recognition in any form besides polite indifference. Victoria stepped outside the ward for a moment, and the hush in the corridor allowed a nurse to say, almost as if reading from a page, "We'll get palliative consults involved. We'll contact social work. We'll assemble the care team." The medical truth was heavy, and yet the larger, more complicated truth hovered. A system had been blind in small ways that mattered. That morning, something in the hospital changed angle. News travels strange regimes. The short video of accountability, tenderness, and a janitor's gentle hand hit people where they lived on their phones. Comments poured in. some with flint, some with warmth. Someone tagged a local reporter. Someone else sent it to a parent advocacy group. The hospital's public communications team, accustomed to controlling messages, found itself responding to a flood that no memo could fully shape. Victoria, by the time she returned, had made calls. She had drafted a brief statement that acknowledged the oversight and outlined immediate steps. She stood in front of the ward like a person who had finally decided to do the thing she had always thought the job demanded, to use power as a salve and as an accountability. She also found a quieter moment, the kind directors rarely publicly claim. She came to the bench outside the ward where Daniel had rested his back for a moment, the handkerchief peeking from his pocket like a soldier's flag. "Daniel," she said, asking for his name again, because there are times when the human detail matters more than the ledger. "I read your badge earlier. I remember a paper you wrote." He looked up, incredulous. "Me?" "Yes," she said. "A paper about HVAC controls in critical care units. We used it when the new wing was being designed. Your name was on the credits." A quick private heat of shame flushed him. He had published at the start of his career when his hands were steadier and the nights were full of possibility. At the time, the paper had been a small thing among many professional works. Life had rearranged his path. It was a fact he did not parade. "That was a long time ago," he said. That was not small. She turned the memory into a bridge. "We used your work. Your designs helped orient how we built the play area and the air systems. It means something." She looked at him as if bargaining with a truth he might not accept. "You've cared for this place in ways that matter." Daniel was unused to being seen across these distances. The property of small acts is that they accumulate into a quiet worth that nobody declares until someone in a place of power says it out loud. Victoria said it, the word "thank you," arriving like a token that shifted the room. Then she returned to the most difficult socket of the morning, the medical truth. She called together people, nurses, doctors, a social worker, and said plainly, "We need to assemble a care plan, not a miracle, a plan. We need to help the family through the choices. We also need to look at how we missed signs earlier and fix it." Some parents stood, some sat. Those who had been judgmental earlier now lowered their heads or reached across the room to touch hands they had not noticed before. Shame is a quiet tool. It presses people into facing the small cruelty that slips out of polite conversation. Emily's mother cried then, a clean, dissolved noise that broke in the center of the room. It was not theatrical. It was the sort of release that comes from the unraveling of fear and a sudden, brittle hope that the system would do whatever it could to help. Daniel, hesitant, slid into the chair next to her and offered his hand again, the handkerchief a small white flag in his pocket. Inside the hospital conference room, in the hum of people who suddenly had to answer to more than their schedules, Victoria broke the news to staff with the same resoluteness she had used with the family. She announced additional measures: extra rounds, a review of patient follow-up protocols, and an immediate audit of similar cases. She would speak to the board, she promised, and though she could not promise outcomes that were outside medicine's power, she promised to care for the process and to hold the hospital accountable. It helped that the video had presence beyond the ward. It brought public attention and pressure in a way that was awkward and useful. People wrote messages of support. The hospital's inbox filled with offers from volunteers and professionals willing to donate time and expertise. Local community organizations sent blankets and toys. The response was not a cure, but it felt like a network of hands reaching into a place of need. Daniel felt the room tilt. He had never sought recognition. He only wanted his daughter's life to be arranged as carefully as he could manage. But the recognition unlocked practical things. A local advocacy group called and offered counseling services to the family. A former colleague, someone who had read the same technical paper, reached out and offered to help with fundraising to get Emily additional support systems. The ripple did what ripples do. It moved outward and gathered people into a swell. That night, after the meetings dissolved and the ward lights dimmed to a more forgiving glow, Daniel found himself sitting outside on the hospital steps with Lily, who had come to visit after school. She wore glitter on her fingers. She propped a paper bridge made from popsicle sticks on her knee and watched him with the precise love only a child could measure. "Daddy," she said, in the direct way of children who see things whole, "did that lady know you before?" Daniel wrapped his arm around Lily and felt the weight of small things. "She knew me by name from papers I wrote when I was young," he said. "She saw me tonight because she had to see." Lily picked at the edge of her bridge. "I like it when you make people laugh." "I like it too," he answered. Inside, Emily slept with a gentle, machine-measured breath. A volunteer had placed a little paper crown on the bedside table, the sort of ridiculous, regal object children hoist at hospital parties. Daniel had taught Lily how to make tiny paper crowns. He imagined Emily waking and smiling again. The moral moment of the night was not theatrical. It was in the way the ward had been reoriented towards seeing people again. It was in the way Victoria used her authority to admit fault and to call for better care. It was in the way other visitors, who earlier had glossed pain with averted eyes, came to the small acts of service and apologized in clumsy human ways. A few days later, a short local news feature ran. It called the clip "A Moment of Seeing." It showed a director who had spoken plainly, a janitor who had pushed a bed to the window, and a little girl who had laughed at a pop song in the middle of a ward. The coverage did not pretend to be a story about victory. It was about the ripple effect of a modest act made public. People commented and shared, and the hospital's inbox filled with donations. Some money for support services, some offerings of time from specialists. A small foundation offered to fund an audit of follow-up procedures for pediatric cases. A local engineering firm agreed to review the mechanical systems that supported the ward to ensure no structural lapses contributed to oversight. Daniel received a message from someone who had known him long ago, a note from a former supervisor who remembered his paper and the man who wrote it. The message was simple. "We used your designs. We see you." The sentence hit him in a place that made the breath catch in his chest, like the memory of Sarah's name on the phone screen. But the hardest thing remained. The medical truth had not shifted because of attention. The scans were what they were. The professionals had gathered and laid out a plan. Treatment options with possible outcomes, palliative care if needed, pain management, and psychological support for the family. Victoria had been clear. "We cannot promise miracles. We promise competence, transparency, and compassion." In the smallness of the days that followed, Daniel learned how to hold all those things at once. He learned how to explain to Lily the difference between hope and certainty. He learned how to let strangers help without feeling diminished. He carried Sarah's handkerchief and unfolded it like a map of memory. Every so often during the day, he would take it and rub the embroidered edge between his fingers, searching for steady ground. Emily's mother came to find him in the hallway one afternoon. Her face was drawn but less raw than the first night. "Thank you," she said simply, "for sitting with her, for the song." Daniel felt small and large at once. "I couldn't do much," he said, "just the window." "You did more than that," she replied. "You made her feel seen." Her eyes shone in a way that did not ask for more. Daniel thought about the word dignified. It sounded like a heavy, public thing, but what it had been in that little room was permission. Permission to laugh, to be scared, to ask the bluntest of questions, and to be given a truthful answer without cruelty. It was not performance, it was recognition. There were harder days yet. Some mornings Emily woke in pain and the team adjusted medication. Some evenings the family sat in quiet. Daniel and Lily learned the rhythm of hospital stays, the drop-in of nurses with charts, the ritual of the coffee machine at 2 a.m., the way the fluorescent lights could reveal every freckle on a child's arm. They carried the knowledge Victoria had spoken to them. We will answer for the mistakes we find. And with that, the family navigated the practicalities of treatment. In public, the hospital's response unfolded into concrete steps. A temporary fund was created to assist families with out-of-pocket needs. Specialists came in to consult. The hospital started a campaign to train staff in more attentive observational protocols for pediatric patients. A small but meaningful change to prevent the kind of oversight that had occurred. Victoria made the difficult calls to the board and outlined the steps the hospital would take to be better at noticing. It was not an instantaneous fix. Systems changed slowly, with layers of committees and financial constraints. But people who had watched the video found ways to make immediate differences. Donations that paid for parking, for laundry services, for a child's toy that could make a room feel less like a ward. It was not a cure, but it was conversion of attention into tangible care. One afternoon, as a late winter light softened to puddled gold, Emily asked Daniel a differently small question. "Will I still be me?" she asked, fingering the edge of her blanket, the way children search for permanence. He looked at her, at the freckle near her ear that made a constellation when she tilted her head. He knew the medical charts would answer some parts of the question, and they would not answer others. But his life had taught him a kind of humble courage. "Yes," he told her, "you'll still be you, and we'll be here with you." She smiled, the kind of smile that held a universe of small rebellions against fear. She reached out and tapped the paper crown, turning it around like a coin. "Promise?" she asked. Daniel pulled from his pocket the handkerchief and pressed it into his palm like an amulet. He had promised Lily pancakes, and he would keep that promise. He would also keep, in the way a father keeps things, the promise to be present. Outside the hospital, the city did what cities do. It continued to live. People moved through mornings, coffees, errands. But in a small corner of a ward, something different had shifted. People who had once been content to glance away stopped glancing. A director had spoken in the precise manner of hard authority about institutional responsibility, and had then walked into the harder world of human apology. A janitor's small act had reminded the staff and the visitors that dignity cost nothing but attention. Not everyone in the world changed because of it. Not every wrong in a hospital was fixed overnight. But for Emily and her family, for Daniel and Lily, the shift meant that the ward admitted its faults and sought to be better. It meant that for a time, and maybe longer, more people would be seen. On the night a small snow began to fall, dusting the parking lot with a quiet white, Daniel walked out of the hospital doors with Lily on his hip. They paused at the curb and looked at the shallow flakes. He reached into his pocket and showed her the small square of fabric, its embroidery worn but intact. "Keep faith in small things," he told her. "They're how we get by." Lily frowned like all sensible children do when a philosophy is proposed. "Do you mean pancakes?" "I mean pancakes," he said, laughing. And then he added, "and windows, and songs, and names, remembering names." She nodded solemnly, which in children means she had understood something essential. They walked toward the car, the snow making little confetti on their shoulders. In the months after, the ward had new signs, small notices of training dates, and a chart showing the hospital's commitments. Victoria sent occasional updates to the families involved, as much a record of progress as an attempt at contrition. Daniel kept working his shifts, smoothing out the hospital's small irritations. He still fixed squeaky doors and found lost stuffed animals. He still answered Lily's school phone calls and folded her sheets with the care of someone who knew what he had to hold on to. The public attention softened, as public things do, but the changes were not entirely ephemeral. Where there had been indifference, there was now a mechanism for being called to account. Where there had been a single moment of seeing, there were now meetings and memos and people who had to explain why a child's signs were missed. The small ripple had become a series of measures. One evening, as he walked the corridor, Daniel saw a small group gathered near a patient's door. Someone explained that they were practicing a new check-in routine. He paused and listened. A nurse called out, "Thank you," to the person who had suggested a small change. People were saying thank you more, and in the hospital that mattered. Admissions were the same. The disease's course in people's bodies was still the sparse chart that medicine drew. But there was less of the reflexive passing by that had made the world harder for people like Emily. On a quiet night months later, Victoria found Daniel sweeping outside the pediatric wing alone. The world was quieter then, the kind of night that feels like a held breath. She watched him work for a moment, the mop moving like a slow metronome. She stepped closer. "You still have the handkerchief?" she said. It was not a question. He smiled in that embarrassed way that men sometimes do when given praise. "Yeah," he said. "My wife—" He stopped the sentence. There were parts of that life that were only spoken in the way fingers work the hem of fabric. It helps. "I wanted to say something else," Victoria said. "That day, when I spoke in the ward, I had to make choices about what to say that could change things. I want you to know I tried to do it right." He looked up at her, surprised by the admission in her tone. She was not a woman who made many confessions. "You did," he told her simply. "You saw people." She nodded. "You saw someone that needed to be noticed. That's the start." She hesitated, searching for a form of gratitude that could convey what she felt. "And I wanted to tell you that just because the world sometimes misses people doesn't mean they are less. I'm sorry it took a video for us to move." "No," he said. "You moved because you had to. Someone had to. Thank you for making it real." They stood in the hospital's soft light until the night nurse called for a patient. Then, as directors and janitors must, they each returned to their particular and important work. The story did not become a tidy sermon of redemption. The medical facts remained stubbornly medical. There were appointments and decisions. There were days of small progress and days of particular sorrow. But the moment of the window, the song, and the director's direct words had done something crucial. They reoriented people's gauge. The ward, and for some, the hospital at large, acquired a little more ability to see the humans it held. At home, Lily asked him once which part of the day made him feel proud. Daniel thought of Sarah and of the nights he had held Lily close. He thought of a child who had worried about whether she was dying and who had been told the truth in a room where she had been seen. "The part when you laugh," he said at last. "When someone laughs and the whole room opens a little." He kissed Lily's brow and folded the handkerchief into the drawer where he kept small things. When people later asked Emily's family about the start of the change, they often spoke about the director's clarity and the staff's new practices. But Emily's mother liked to tell a simpler version, how a man in a janitor's uniform pushed a bed to the window and turned on a cheerful song because a child needed it. That, she said, made everyone remember what mattered first. The video, the hospital response, and the slow work of change were parts of the same knot. Some of the knot's strings pulled into policy. Some pulled into tenderness. None untied everything. But for Daniel, Lily, and Emily, the idea that people mattered beyond their charts became less abstract. On a porch a few weeks later, after a day that had held small mercies and awkward truths, Daniel tucked the handkerchief into his pocket and felt its familiar texture. He looked at Lily, who was tracing the outline of a popsicle stick bridge. He thought of the question that had started it all, the raw whisper that had stopped him in his broom bristle tracks, and felt the counterweight of what followed: seeing, naming, and doing. Kindness had not cured everything. It had not promised miracles. But it had made a room into a place where a child could be heard asking the hardest question she could imagine and be answered with truth and with care. It had made a director speak both fact and responsibility, and had made a community reach, awkwardly and sometimes late, toward accountability. They walked back toward the car together, the snow nearly gone, the air thin and clear. Daniel folded the handkerchief into his palm and felt its worn edge. He looked at Lily, who was tracing the outline of a popsicle stick bridge. He thought of the question that had started it all, the raw whisper that had stopped him in his broom bristle tracks, and felt the counterweight of what followed: seeing, naming, and doing. Kindness had not cured everything. It had not promised miracles. But it had made a room into a place where a child could be heard asking the hardest question she could imagine and be answered with truth and with care. It had made a director speak both fact and responsibility, and had made a community reach, awkwardly and sometimes late, toward accountability. They walked back toward the car together, the snow nearly gone, the air thin and clear. Daniel folded the handkerchief into his palm and felt its worn edge. He had learned that dignity did not require grand gestures. It required simple seeing and honest action. As they passed the hospital doors, he looked once more at the bright windows and, a little to himself, said, "We'll keep watching each other." Lily smiled up at him. "Promise?" He smiled, and this time his promise was full and practical. Promise. If this moved you, share it. Let kindness ripple further.